Good. Is that better now?
Yes, that's us.
All right. Thanks, Andrew, for your very kind invitation to be here tonight. It's great. I've been at a number of meetings before. Remember a really good one by Michael Hayden speaking and Samuel Pearce, which must be about 20 years ago now. But it's great. Sorry, it's great to be back. Anyway, I apologise for the change of plans this week. I'm afraid it was just totally out of my control, and I appreciate everybody's flexibility for still going on with this. So anyway, tonight I want to speak about Darby, Brethren and Baptists. And as you'll see as we go through, there's a number of things between two streams of evangelical Christianity that seem at first glance often to be very similar, but actually on closer inspection are quite distinct and quite different. And one of the things I want to be mentioning tonight is just the curiosity of common roots that both of these communities have here in this island. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about the Brethren. There's a common assumption, I think, that Brethren are Baptistic. They're not Baptist, but they're the next best thing, maybe apart from Assemblies of God or something like that, because at least, whatever else they get wrong, they get believers' baptism right. However, I think the situation is actually a bit more complicated than that, especially here, where Brethren and Baptists have a long and quite complex history of interaction, of exchange of membership, sometimes exchange of leadership, and certainly in a very significant way, an important exchange of ideas. So Brethren are not necessarily Baptistic. In fact, if you read into the historical material, you very quickly discover that Brethren didn't, and still don't, have a common position in baptism. There was the Brethren movement, as you probably know, had a big split in the 1840s between open and exclusive branches. While it's true to say that most open Brethren since then have embraced believers' baptism, a significant but very small minority did not. And it's also true to notice that the exclusive Brethren in these islands, Britain and Ireland, tended to be overwhelmingly Pedobaptist or household Baptists, whereas exclusive Brethren on the continent tended to be believers Baptist. Among the exclusive Brethren, despite this difference of practice, baptism was never a subject of controversy. There's a famous anecdote in Brethren history that has Darby asked by an inquirer, "Mr. Darby, what does Wigram hold on baptism?" Wigram being his best friend and chief lieutenant. And Darby's response, "Madam, he holds his tongue." The fact was that Wigram held to believers' baptism, while Darby, through his entire life, held to pedobaptism, a position he described as household baptism. So why are we talking about Darby and the Brethren at the Irish Baptist Historical Society meeting? Well, I want to suggest tonight that despite his reticence to discuss the topic of baptism, Darby actually has an important place in Baptist history. I say that because both the Brethren movement and one of the important 19th century streams of English particular or Calvinistic Baptist life, the strict and particular Baptists, both of these communities emerged from a revival of high Calvinism in Oxford in the 1820s. And both of these groups, the Brethren and the strict and particular Baptists, drew upon the long theological legacy of 18th century dissent in different ways. Both of these communities picked up upon different parts of the idea system of high Calvinist churches in the 18th century. For example, denying that the moral law was the Christian's rule of life, or, for example, emphasizing the importance of premillennialism. These were two doctrines that were very typical of 18th century high Calvinism. And so it's no surprise then that as both of these communities began to form and evolve after the revival of Calvinism in Oxford in the 1820s, both of these groups, Brethren and strict and particular Baptists, were sometimes accused of being high Calvinists. In the case of the strict and particular Baptists, often with justification. In the case of the Brethren, very rarely with any justification at all. So where does Darby fit into all of this? Well, if you know much about the strict and particular Baptists in the 19th century, if you've read Robert Oliver's really excellent book on the English particular Baptists, you might have come across the name J.C. Philpott, one of the most famous of the Oxford seceders in the 1820s and 30s, and someone who became the recognised leader of the gospel standard strict and particular Baptist tradition. Well, J.C. Philpott was actually converted through Darby's ministry. Philpott, after his Oxford career, travelled to Ireland, where he worked as a tutor for Darby's sister's children, and it was through Darby's ministry in that household that Philpott became a believer in Jesus Christ. Shortly after that, he abandoned his plans for ordination in the Church of England and instead drifted into the strict and particular Baptist ministry. Now, Darby is in a similar kind of situation to J.C. Philpott in the 1820s and 1830s, in that he also abandons Anglicanism. But unlike J.C. Philpott and many of the other seceders, Henry Bulteel among them, Darby never became a Baptist. Here's a quotation from one of his letters. "I have the deep conviction that a Christian is doing wrong in not having his children baptized. But although for a moment I did have some difficulty in accepting it, I recognize fully my brother who does not do as I do. I'm convinced that it's ignorance of the ways of God, but convinced also that my brother is acting conscientiously. I honour him in what he does instead of finding it a subject of contention." And that's why, of course, Darby addressed it in a letter rather than in a published piece in a journal or a magazine. So Brethren and Baptist approaches to baptism were fundamentally dissimilar, certainly in the first couple of generations of the Brethren movement. Brethren variety of practice on baptism reflected a variety of ways of thinking about baptism and of thinking about what baptism does. Now, while Baptists and almost all open brethren adopted believers' baptism, they described it typically as an outward sign of inward grace or a form of words corresponding to that. But exclusive brethren maintained a much higher and a much more objective view of baptism, so that they were happy to say that baptism does something. So, for example, a famous set of letters by C.W. Wycherley on baptism, defending household baptism. Wycherley argues that baptism makes a child a Christian outwardly. Now, what's the background to this way of thinking about baptism? Well, in many respects, it goes back to Darby himself, because Darby, with the other early exclusive leaders, argued that baptism worked to do something. It brought children into the outward profession of Christianity, which he described as the house of God. So from Darby's perspective, household baptism, Trinitarian baptism, wherever it took place, was incorporating the subjects of that baptism into Christendom, into the house of God. Now, later exclusives would modify that somewhat, but that was Darby's position. And Darby distinguished water baptism, which brought individuals into the external profession of Christianity, from spirit baptism following regeneration, which brings an individual into the body of Christ. Now, obviously, this cuts across a great deal of Baptist thinking. Perhaps not all Baptist thinking. The recent recovery of sacramentalism among English Baptists particularly might qualify some of the things I'm going to say here. But generally, Darby's recognition of all Trinitarian baptisms as valid really distinguished the position of the exclusive brethren and the open brethren, the very small number of open brethren who adopted his position. It distinguished them from Baptists and most open brethren. Most Baptists and open brethren believed that their view of believer baptism was integral to the church's purity. But Darby and the other exclusives argued that their understanding of baptism was essential to safeguarding the church's Catholicity, is a tension that we see recurring throughout Christian history. And so we see in the common origins of the Brethren and this particular part of the Baptist movement, we see a gradual set of developments that lead not to one but to several parting of the ways, an exchange of personnel, an exchange of leadership, and, as I said before, often also an exchange of ideas. And as I was thinking about how maybe to talk about this evening, I was thinking about my old saintly granny, who was, in my childhood and youth, a very devoted member of Antrim Gospel Hall, but who in previous decades had been part of a Baptist church as well. And it made me realise that this exchange of personnel between these two movements is probably something that many of us this evening are quite familiar with. Maybe some of you, from a Baptist perspective, I guess mostly, have relatives or even experience on the other side of the fence, as it were. And as I thought about my grandmother, I remembered the poem that she taught me. She loved poetry. She was often quoting poetry. And this is the only poem she ever taught me. Sir Edward Carson had a cat. It sat upon the fender, and every time it caught a rat, the rest of the poem is about something to do with Baptists. But anyway, it made me think that perhaps the best way to approach this question was to think about Darby, Brethren and the Baptists as a story in three Carsons. So let's talk about Alexander Carson, a name I'm sure familiar to you all. David Kingdon published a very important article in the Society's Journal back in 1970. And I'm sure many of you have read and heard a great deal about Alexander Carson ever since. Now, if you're familiar with Alexander Carson, you'll be aware of his commitment to primitivism, his commitment to doing things the New Testament way. He starts off as a minister in the General Synod of Ulster, which in that period, remember, was strongly Presbyterian, however, not subscriptional or not confessional, and included within it both solid evangelical Trinitarians and also several species of Arians. And you'll remember how Carson leaves the Presbyterian denomination and becomes a Congregationalist, and in popular memory, he quickly becomes a Baptist and becomes one of the great forefathers, really, of the Irish Baptist Association. But was he really a Baptist? Well, we know, broadly speaking, the landmarks of his spiritual history. In 1805, he publishes Reasons for Separating from the General Synod of Ulster, when he laments the presence of anti-Trinitarians in that body. We know that around a year or two after that, we're not exactly sure when, he adopts the conviction of believers' baptism and incorporates that into the life of the church that he leads in Tobermoor. And we know, of course, most famously of all, that Carson comes to international fame in the 1830s when he publishes his extraordinary book, Baptism in its Mode and Subjects, a book that remains in print today and continues to be very widely read as a defense of the believer Baptist position. However, Carson might not have been a Baptist. Certainly, this is actually the real reason we're doing this by Zoom. It's so that you can't throw things at me. But Carson's Baptist church, Baptist in inverted commas, was certainly not typical of the congregations that would come to make up the Irish Baptist tradition, even though it's often identified as a kind of founding church in the movement or in associational thinking. It really isn't. It didn't apply the doctrine of believers' baptism to its understanding of church membership. It certainly didn't apply the doctrine of believers' baptism. Centuries before, it practiced open membership, it practiced open communion, and the only requirement of admission to membership in Carson's Baptist church in Tobermoor was a credible profession of faith. But that's not all that made Carson's church distinctive. For all that many of Carson's views were Calvinistic, and for all that he's often reckoned to be a Calvinistic Baptist, Carson was not what we could really call Reformed. Now, his church practiced weekly communion and closed communion. It was very strict as to who was allowed to participate in communion, Baptism wasn't an issue, but a moral life, a godly profession certainly was. But in addition to the pastor's sermon, every Sunday morning service also allowed opportunity for exhortation by other of the brethren too. They practiced the kiss of peace and other kinds of things that we'll talk about in just a second. So while Alexander Carson had a kind of status within the English Baptist movement, for example, going on a preaching tour for the Baptist Missionary Society, he was never formally identified with English Baptists, but he was formally identified with the so-called Scotch Baptists. Now, the Scotch Baptists, if you remember, were Sandemanian. They had adopted views of saving faith that were often dismissed as being no more than historical faith. They understood that saving faith was a simple intellectual assent to the propositions of the gospel. The affections, the will, didn't really need to be involved in that. And that was what Carson was preaching. His views of saving faith were Sandemanian. In fact, when Carson died in 1844, his family got in touch with one of the leading Sandemanian theologians in England to ask that individual to write their father's biography. Not only so, but Carson's church was part of an international Sandemanian network. In 1820, there was a small publication appeared that collected correspondence from churches in New York and Massachusetts with other churches dotted across the island of Ireland: Tobermoor, Londonderry, Ballygolly, Crilly and Tyrone, Camone Green near Omagh, church in Monaghan and Sligo and Kilkenny, one in Waterford, two in Cork, and one in Dublin. Interestingly, of those churches, or of those congregations listed in that 1820 publication, the one in Camone Green by the 1860s had given birth both to a Baptist church and to a Brethren assembly. Now, this really interesting set of correspondence allowed each of these churches to describe what they did. And the churches were comparing their practice with each other. They had varied views of baptism. They had varied views of baptism's relationship to communion. They had varied views of office and gift in the church. Some of them practiced foot washing. Many of them practiced holy kissing. That's the second reason I wanted to do this by Zoom tonight, in case anyone wanted to practice holy kissing this evening. But the really interesting thing about the Tobermoor Church's letter in the first part of an epistolary correspondence, 1820, is its description of how it operated. The church prioritized Catholicity over baptism. So here is the letter. Got to understand, I think, that it's written by Alexander Carson himself. The order in which we observe the ordinances, he says, in the first day of the week is as follows: salutation, singing, a metrical psalm, reading the scriptures, prayer, singing, another metrical psalm, admission or exclusion, so that's to prohibit individuals from coming to the Lord's Supper, which is the next item in the order of service after the Lord's Supper. More singing, fellowship, which is, I think, a very nice way of saying collection, exhortation, which means the opportunity for various brethren to stand, to exhort, to contribute to the service publicly, teaching, which is the pastor's sermon, another prayer, another metrical psalm, and a closing prayer. So who was allowed to be a member of the so-called Baptist Church? Carson says later on in the letter, we all deem that the man who has been received by Jesus ought not to be rejected by us. And that if Jesus feeds his people by his ordinances, it would be criminal on us, as far as lies in our power, to join in confederacy to starve the weakest of them. We think that the man who's been admitted to the fellowship of the General Assembly and Church of the Firstborn, Hebrews, is undoubtedly worthy of a seat with us. We think that the man who's been admitted to the fellowship of the General Assembly and Church of the Firstborn is undoubtedly, Carson says, the Tobermoor congregation, for all that he was preaching believers' baptism, wanted to limit the Lord's Supper not to those who had been baptized, wanted to limit membership not to those who had been baptized as believers, but instead to recognize a work, wherever they recognized the work of grace, they wanted to be able to welcome that person into church fellowship. So how does Darby fit into all of this? Well, in the 1830s, not very long after that correspondence was published, Darby began his work connecting the little cultures, communities of dissent that he found or established across Ireland. Here's one of his letters from 1833. I hear the north of Ireland is dotted with little bodies, he said, meeting as you do, though I do not know the places. And then he added this very famous statement, which I think we hold in tension with some of his later statements in the same subject. But listen to how this echoes what Carson was saying. Darby says, you're nothing, nobody but Christians. And the moment you cease to be an available mount for communion for any consistent Christian, you'll go to pieces or help the evil. A little bit later, again in 1833, he says, many little bodies are springing up, things are assuming a new shape, though they are unformed. And what Darby was doing in those early days was not just establishing something new, not just calling people out of the established churches. He was also looking to make connections between other little communities of dissenters and pulling them together eventually to form into what we recognise today as the Brethren community in Ireland. Now, Carson's Sandemanian network was eventually incorporated into Brethren history. We know that because at the end of the 19th century, in 1889, a Brethren publisher republished that 1820 set of letters, arguing that this was a beginning for the Brethren movement on this island. And there could be some warrant for that claim because by 1889, as we saw, the assembly in Omagh had been established as having some kind of legacy from one of the churches included in that correspondence. So what does this tell us then about the context out of which the Brethren and the modern Irish Baptist movement emerged? Well, I think one of the really interesting things to observe is that in the very beginning of the 19th century and in both sides of the Atlantic, little communities of Christians who had dropped out of mainstream denominations were well established. They might not know who they were. They might not have sorted out their position on such issues as foot washing or holy kissing, or whether ministry should be confined to an ordained minister or whether other brethren should be allowed to contribute as well. They might not have agreed on whether baptism should be of believers only or of children. They might not have agreed whether saving faith should be understood in a Sandemanian sense or in a much more traditional evangelical or reformed sense. But they existed, they were connected, and they were connected on both sides of the Atlantic. And what's also, I think, very interesting to notice about these groups is that they were often developing or experimenting in practices that the Brethren movement, as it became established, as it would consolidate, would eventually come to share. However, there's one big difference between these groups and certainly the exclusive Brethren as that tradition developed. Because all of the groups in the 1820 correspondence were restorationist. In other words, they looked to the New Testament to see the shape of a New Testament church and then to practice it for themselves. But the exclusive Brethren, while they were also primitivist, while they also looked to the primitive church for a model or an ideal model of church life, they were not restorationist. They recognized the church was ruined and denied any possibility that the church, the true New Testament church, could be restored. Now, we can, I think, see some of these theological tensions working out over 3 generations in the history of the Carson family. So we're talking about Alexander Carson at Tobermore, married to Margaret, the parents of 13 children. Several of those children remained very closely identified with their father's work, often understanding themselves to be continuing it, even within his own congregation, in his own pulpit in Tobermoor. And after Alexander Carson's death in 1844, a number of his sons worked to create a kind of memorial project for their father. And one of the things that they seem to be doing after Alexander's death in 1844 is rescuing their father's reputation. And the success of their project is measured by the fact that today we understand Alexander Carson as a Calvinistic, perhaps even a Reformed Baptist, rather than as pastor of an experimental, improvisory, Sandemanian, open communion, open membership congregation. So how did he do this? Well, that's what we're going to be thinking about over the next few moments. And there's three sons really I'm going to be talking about in some detail this evening. I'm going to speak about George Ledley Carson, who I think was his second oldest from memory. He was a surgeon, trained in Glasgow, but trained as a doctor precisely so he could work as a Baptist minister in Coleraine. That's the first brother, George. We're also going to think about James Crawford Ledley Carson, who also practiced medicine in Coleraine, but he was not a pastor. He became a theological writer, most notably publishing a book called The Heresies of the Plymouth Brethren. And the third brother that we're going to think about tonight is Robert Haldane Carson. Robert was a minister in Perth in Scotland, but eventually was called back to Tobermoor to follow in his father's footsteps. And Robert seems to have had a very unusual relationship with the Brethren. In 1876, he invited David Ray, who was a kind of freelance Brethren evangelist, to lead a mission in Tobermoor Church. There were something like 96 baptisms that took place after that mission, a mission of really striking success in terms of conviction of sin and belief in the gospel. And one of the people who was converted in that mission was Robert Haldane Carson's son. But was he grateful? Not sure, because only 4 years later, Robert Haldane Carson went on to publish a critique of the Brethren of his own, the Brethren, their worship and the Word of God at open variance. So of those three brothers, let's talk most of all about James. So James, a medical man, working in Coleraine, wants to make his contribution to preserving his father's legacy. And he does that by beginning to write letters in the Coleraine Chronicle, letters that critique recently published work by J. and Darby, and also by one of his popularizers, the Coleraine-based exclusive Brethren writer and evangelist, C.H. Mackintosh, often abbreviated to C.H.M. So, what did Carson think? What did James Carson think about Darby and C.H.M.? Well, he believed that Darby had made shipwreck of his faith, and his adherents, instead of trying to reach the shore on planks of the broken vessel, are drifting far out to sea, not knowing whether they're floating. And to prove that claim, Carson cited the published work of C.H.M. as evidence. Why did he do that? Well, Mackintosh was a well-known popularizer of Darby's theology. His notes in the Pentateuch were books that were found in many evangelical churches in this part of the world, in Scotland and also in North America, where they had a phenomenal impact on the preaching of D.L. Moody. In fact, D.L. Moody said that he would be parted from all the books in his library, with the exception of Mackintosh on the Pentateuch, because he found in there such a complete body of divinity. Well, what had drawn Mackintosh up to Coleraine? It's not completely clear, but we know that he arrived in Coleraine about 1857, 2 years before the outbreak of revival just up the road here in Kells Corner, where I am based this evening. And that revival, which the Brethren, open and exclusives, really embraced and worked hard to promote, led to really rapid growth among Brethren and really rapid growth among Baptists. Rating in terms of growth out of the 1859 revival did so in some tension with each other, precisely because the boundaries between them were not always clear. So James Carson, after the 1859 revival and the sudden burst of growth for the Baptists and the Brethren is now trying to draw lines between them. So, 1862 he begins to write the Coleraine Chronicle, and he is greatly exercised by one of those books that made such an, or that was going to make such an impression on D.L. Moody. That's Mackintosh's Notes on Leviticus. And he is horrified because in Mackintosh's book, Notes on Leviticus, he discovers that Mackintosh describes the Lord Jesus as, I quote, the heavenly man. Now, we might run our eyes over that expression and give the writer the benefit of the doubt and understand that there's no real attempt being made to undermine Chalcedonian orthodoxy, but Carson was not that kind of reader. He grabbed hold of that tiny expression and really went to town with it. Now, there's no doubt that that's a problematic expression to describe Christ as the heavenly man with regard to his humanity, and of course it echoed with some of the ancient errors within the church, errors that had been revived among the Anabaptists, the heavenly flesh of Christ, the heavenly humanity of Christ, and that's really what Carson is worried about. Now, Darby agreed with Carson that Mackintosh had written inexactly. And so he and others worked on Mackintosh to have him publish a corrected version of the Notes on Leviticus, which came out a year or two later with the problematic material revised. That didn't stop Carson. He continued his attack. In fact, he expanded his letters in the Coleraine Chronicle into a book, The Heresies of the Plymouth Brethren, which he published in 1862. Within 6 months, around 10,000 copies had been distributed. He enlarged it. It became a book. It remained in print for 10, 12 years. And his attacks on Mackintosh and the Brethren in general were simply relentless. I've given you here some quotations to give you a flavour of his attitude to debate. Some of the Plymouthists have wasted their time in writing to me. For their satisfaction, he said, I may state that through their letters in the grate at the back of the fire. His writing was full of really bad faith arguments. In place of trying to make everything plain and specific to the eye of the Christian public, the Darbyites have managed to cloak their opinions by using language in a Jesuitical sense, wily and slippery customers. So what's he complaining about? He can't understand them. However, he claims that he can. He focused on the worst possible construction of any of the ambiguous language he found in Mackintosh's writing. I'm convinced, he says, when Mackintosh penned these words, he understood them in the very same sense as I do. And then he came to his conclusion. Mackintosh was promoting rank Socinianism. And on the other side of the screen there's a couple of screenshots that give you, I hope, just a sense of the way in which Carson was making his case. Cannot possibly deny that the line I've taken from page 35 contains this meaning and no other. And even though the meaning is never developed anywhere else in the other 351 pages, the fact that it's there means it controls the entire interpretation of the book. Or look at the second extract I've put down there from Carson's writing, where Carson basically says, even though Mackintosh is saying things that are absolutely orthodox, things that I absolutely do believe, I know he's not telling us what he really thinks is true. Now, why was Carson behaving in this way? Well, his response to the Brethren was really ferocious. And what he's trying to do in 1862, just a couple of years after the revival, is really work hard to identify the Baptists with respectable mainstream denominations. Even as this competition for membership with the Brethren was beginning to be felt. That's the first thing I think he's doing, to make the Baptists respectable by focusing criticism on somebody else. The second thing I think he's trying to do is to reclaim his father for Reformed orthodoxy. He writes about the Brethren, he talks about their heresy, he talks about their blasphemy. These are incredibly strong terms. And he contrasts the error, heresy, and blasphemy of the Brethren with the orthodoxy of his own father. And he identifies his own father's orthodoxy with that of the established church, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists, the Independents, and the Covenanters. Hurrah for the Covenanters. And here's a couple of screenshots from his works that show you him doing that, quoting his father at great length. Greater zeal, says my father, in the 5th volume of his works. And the plan of salvation through Christ, says my father, and so on, and so on. And every time James Carson mentions his father Alexander, it's to prove that Alexander is orthodox and the brethren are blasphemers. Now, James Carson did not easily give up his attack on the brethren. He kept it going for well over a decade. Even in 1871, he was writing to the Coleraine Chronicle, describing the chamber of horrors that the brethren concealed, describing the brethren as a tyrannical and Jesuitical sect. And it worked. By 1870, there were 13,000 copies of his book in circulation. And people were paying attention. Even in London, C.H. Spurgeon took up some of Carson's rhetoric when he came to review Darby's New Testament, translation of the New Testament, in December 1872. Spurgeon said, Darby thinks proper to sweep the worship of Christ out of the New Testament, nor could anything more decided on the subject be said by the most advanced Unitarian minister in London. And even locally, the pressure continued. The Coleraine Chronicle continued to carry attacks on the brethren, including a number of letters by an individual called Vance Macaulay, who had been a member of the brethren, who had returned to the Presbyterian Church and wrote letters to the Coleraine Chronicle, paraphrasing Spurgeon's criticism and paraphrasing the polemic of Alexander Carson. Well, with 13,000 copies in print, Carson's book took on a life of its own. And Darby's letters from Canada in the later 1860s describe the rapid circulation of Carson's book, which frequently reached towns before any Brethren evangelist was able to do so. And so before any Brethren evangelist or preacher or Bible teacher turned up in a town in Ontario or the Greater Toronto region, readers were able to discover for themselves that the Brethren preachers were monstrous, silly, trashy, commonplace, ignorant, illiterate, puffed up with pride and self-conceit, claiming inspiration for everything that they say. Serious charges. And Carson was personal. He described Mackintosh as cowardly. He described Darby as stupid as a block. He claimed that on Mr. Darby's principles, no man could be saved. However, Carson's works were often deeply uninformed. Often, he simply got the wrong end of the stick when he was describing what it was the brethren believed. Often, he got the wrong end of the stick understanding what Reformed orthodoxy was as well. So, at times in his writing, he describes Darby's denial of justification by the imputed righteousness of Christ as a soul-destroying heresy, assuming that Calvin and all of the Westminster divines believed what Carson did about the imputation of the righteousness of Christ as the basis of justification, which they did not. He mangles basic categories like the distinction between communicable and incommunicable divine attributes. And from Darby's perspective, best of all, worst of all, Carson condemned Mackintosh for claiming that the Lord Jesus was conceived by the Holy Ghost, which Carson claimed was a point never established in Scripture, to which Darby merely replied that Mackintosh was quoting from the Apostles' Creed. So Darby responded to Carson's attack privately and publicly. In private, in his letters, he described Carson, writing to Wigram, who was Darby's best confidant, really, described Carson as a spiteful, self-sufficient vapourer. He said in another letter to Wigram, his trusted friend, "I've no doubt Mackintosh has expressed himself unguardedly, but the accusing him of denying the true humanity of Christ is simply unrighteousness. The poor church people glutton in what attacks the brethren, and they feed on ordure. That tract of Carson denies the first elements of Christianity, and they cannot even find it out." I was really struck by that statement that the attacks on brethren are linked, are equivalent merely to order. I thought I knew what order meant. I didn't think that's what Darby would really have meant to write. I looked it up. That is what order means. It really does mean dung. Well, that's how Darby replied in private, writing to his most trusted confidant, G.V. Wigram. In public, he was much, much more moderate and really held back from the vituperative language that James Carson had used. Darby replied to Carson's work in a couple of titles published in 1862, and he very deliberately said he didn't want to answer Carson in kind. He wasn't going to complain of personal attacks. He wanted the issue simply to be, what has Jesus done for us and how do we benefit from it? But the really interesting thing about Darby's response to Carson is that he out-confessionalized Darby's appeal to, or Carson's appeal to Reformed tradition. Carson had claimed that Darby was way out of line with the creedal confession tradition. Darby responded by saying, actually, I'm completely in line with 39 Articles, and I'm completely in line with the Apostles' Creed. No doubt Carson's not of the establishment, Darby said, and has never learned the Creed, the Lord's Supper, and the Ten Commandments in the vulgar tongue. I would recommend those who've got Carson's attacks on the brethren on their table to read the Apostles' Creed in Acts 2, and if they wish to be thought to know something about Christianity, to put Carson's pamphlet on the bookshelf. But Darby recognised that Carson's book was making a real impact against the brethren. I'm told the books and the tables is on the table of evangelicals on every side. Darby said, I pity them. Of course, that asserts that all my tendencies are decidedly Socinian, but that's just the fashion. And Darby recognised that with circulation in the 13,000 range, there was simply no way that the brethren could catch up to control the narrative, if you like, or to engage in a more responsible form of theological debate. So that's Alexander Carson, and that's James Carson, his son. The really interesting thing, though, is that not everyone in James Carson's family found his critique of the brethren convincing. I'm going to speak thirdly about Margaret Ledley Carson. Margaret was the niece of James, the daughter of George Ledley Carson, the niece of James, the polemicist, and the granddaughter of Alexander Carson of Tobermoor. Now, Margaret's childhood was marked by a sequence of family deaths. Her aunts, a couple of her aunts died in 1837, and her father George wrote a very moving devotional biography of them, both in which he speaks to James, or one of the sisters, I should say, speaks to James, Susanna speaks to James, and warns him. You're exposed to temptation, she says to James. Be constantly on your guard, that you may always walk worthy of the gospel you've professed. Now, George was obviously a very kind father figure. His son wrote a verse or a poem, an acrostic poem that memorialized his father, and Margaret did the same thing, a long poem which I will not attempt to read for you. But they were obviously very fond of their father and aware, I think, of the significance of the family they were brought into. Their father had died 6 years before his own father. Their grandfather died. So they had their grandfather with them. They had Alexander Carson with them for 6 years more than they had their own father with them. But what's really interesting is that by the 1860s, maybe by the late 1850s, Margaret had left the Baptist tradition into which she had been born and had actively identified with Darby and Mackintosh, who were, remember, the subjects of her Uncle James's vitriol. And by the early 1860s, she was corresponding with Mackintosh. In early 1861, for example, Mackintosh wrote to her to tell her about the way in which a poem that she had written, Love Lies Bleeding, had been used in the conversion of a worldly Pharisaic old lady in Bath. Now, we don't know when Margaret joined the brethren, but she was obviously quite a remarkable woman, able to make independent theological judgments for herself and having the conviction of those judgments to move out of a very significant family tradition to join a movement that her own uncle had described as being heretical and blasphemous. Now, what makes Margaret's move to the Brethren all the more surprising was the state of the Brethren in the local area. After Macintosh's erroneous publication, the exclusive Brethren in Coleraine really debated his mistakes. Darby was in Portrush in May 1861, and he began to deal with the assembly in Coleraine to try to lead them pastorally through the local challenges that were coming as a consequence of Macintosh's erroneous publication. I judge Macintosh has been very rash in some of his papers, which I'd never seen or heard of. And the words could be attacked, as all human language could, on such subjects. But he's trying to pacify the church and to hold the church together. Meanwhile, members of that little assembly are writing to Wigram and demanding that Darby excommunicate Macintosh from the Coleraine Assembly. William Gribben of Coleraine, Wigram told Darby, is the most Jehu-like of anyone I have seen. William wrote me to stop and excommunicate Macintosh. William Gibbon's letters are bulls to root out and destroy the pestilent error in man, woman, and child. And you know what makes Margaret's action all the more extraordinary is that her family continued to oppose the Brethren. So after James kept up, even as James kept up his correspondence in the Coleraine Chronicle, one of her other uncles, Robert Haldane Carson, now returned from Perth, now back in his father's pulpit in Tobermore, after having seen 96 conversions, baptisms, after the mission of David Ray in 1876, almost immediately turns to write his own critique of the Brethren in 1880. The Brethren, their worship, and the Word of God at open variance. And we know that his book too generated some discussion. Here's a PDF of a review of this book from the Baptist magazine in 1881. But Margaret kept writing. She kept writing poems, developing as a writer, publishing verse in an American magazine called Our Hope as well, probably as in other places too. She was a woman of some independent financial means as well as independent theological conviction, and she seems to have financed the construction of the Gospel Hall in Portrush. She's most famous, though, for a hymn that she called The Victory, a hymn that some of you might have sung from time to time. My chains are snapped, the bonds of sin are broken, and I am free. Oh, let the triumphs of his grace be spoken, who died for me. Why is this hymn significant in the story we're telling today? Well, because the last verse seems to have been added by Macintosh himself and included as part of Margaret Carson's published text. We wait to see the morning star appearing in glory bright. This blessed hope illumes with beams most cheering the hours of light. So what was Margaret doing in identifying with the Brethren rather than with the Baptist tradition into which she had been born? Well, she was doing what I suppose many other people were doing in that period, moving from the big established churches, or the more established churches, as you'll see from the census details there on the screen, and joining smaller religious communities like Baptists or Quakers or even the Brethren. These are the only groups that are growing through this period in the second half of the 19th century. Baptists were growing, but they weren't growing as fast as the Brethren were going to grow. In 1871, the Brethren and the Baptists were more or less the same size, between 4,000 and 5,000 on the island of Ireland. By 1911, however, there were over 10,000 people in Brethren assemblies across the island. And by 1911, the Brethren had become the fourth largest Protestant denomination in the most Protestant part of the island, at the province of Ulster. So that's the story of the Carsons. 3 generations the ambiguity of Alexander to principles that would be adopted by the brethren, the hostility of James in his response to the growth of the brethren, and also the curiosity and loyalty of Margaret, who would do so much to sustain its worship, both locally in building the Gospel Hall in Portrush and internationally through the publication of poems which became well-loved hymns. So what is the relationship then between Darby, Brethren and Baptists? Well, I think fundamentally it's very ambiguous. Ideas would be exchanged, personnel would be exchanged, leaders would be exchanged. And that's one tradition perhaps that continues to the present day. Thanks very much for listening.